Let me ask you something that I think most people in this space have never actually stopped to verify. You installed a privacy browser. Maybe it was Brave, maybe it was Firefox, maybe it was DuckDuckGo. You installed it specifically because the homepage told you it does not track you, it blocks surveillance, it respects your data, and then you just believed it. You closed the browser tab with the marketing page, opened the browser, and went about your life, assuming the promise was being kept. But what if the gap between what those browsers say on their download pages and what they actually do on your network is bigger than you have been told? What if some of the most aggressively marketed privacy browsers in 2026 are doing things during idle startup, before you have visited a single website, before you have typed a single search query, that you would not have accepted if anyone had explained it to you in plain English before you installed? That is the question I decided to stop assuming an answer to and actually test. I spent 3 weeks running structured network captures on 5 of the most popular so-called privacy browsers available right now: Brave, Firefox, DuckDuckGo's desktop browser, Opera, and LibreWolf. I used Wireshark, which is free, open source, and has been independently audited by security researchers for over 2 decades, to capture all outbound network traffic from each browser during a standardized 15-minute idle session on a clean Windows 11 installation. No accounts logged in, no extensions installed beyond defaults, no browsing activity. Just launched the browser, let it sit, and watched exactly what it decided to talk to without me asking it to. The methodology matters here, so let me be specific about it, because vague testing produces vague conclusions, and that is not useful to anyone. For each browser, I used a fresh Windows 11 virtual machine snapshot, installed the browser from the official download source, launched it, and started a 15-minute Wireshark packet capture immediately, without clicking anything or visiting any URL. After the 15 minutes, I analyzed the capture for unique external server connections, categorized those connections by type, update checks, telemetry, advertising infrastructure, third-party service connections, and parent company infrastructure, and compared their results against what each browser's marketing language explicitly claims or strongly implies about its privacy behavior. This is not a theoretical exercise. This is not reading privacy policies and comparing them on a spreadsheet. This is watching actual networker packets leave your machine and asking the only question that matters: does the behavior match the claim? And I want to be upfront about something before we go any further. I went into this test with assumptions, and some of those assumptions were wrong. I expected Brave to be the cleanest. I expected Firefox to be complicated but fundamentally trustworthy. I expected DuckDuckGo to be exactly what the name implies. I expected Opera to be fine, despite the marketing being aggressive. And I expected LibreWolf to be the nerdy, obscure option that most people would never hear about. The results forced me to revise every single one of those assumptions, except the last one. But before I get into the specific findings, I want to establish something important that frames why this test matters in 2026 specifically. The privacy browser market has exploded. A 2025 study found that Google Chrome still dominates global browser market share, but among users who specifically cite privacy as a primary concern for their browser choice, the numbers have shifted dramatically. Brave alone reports around 80 million monthly active users as of 2025. Firefox still holds a significant user base among technical users who trust Mozilla's nonprofit credentials. DuckDuckGo has built its entire corporate identity around privacy as a brand promise since the company launched their search engine in 2008. And in the wake of the $5 billion Google privacy lawsuit settlement in 2024, yes, the Chrome incognito mode case, millions of users actively went looking for alternatives to mainstream browser infrastructure. That context matters because it means the stakes of browser privacy marketing being misleading are not abstract. There are tens of millions of real people who made a specific decision to install one of these browsers specifically to escape something. They were escaping Google's data collection, they were escaping surveillance advertising, they were escaping the feeling of being profiled across every website they visit, and the question of whether what they installed actually protects them from what they were escaping, or whether they just changed which company is doing the profiling, is a question that deserves a real answer backed by real data rather than marketing copy and brand logos. I also want to address the elephant in the room up front. None of the browsers I tested are doing things that are completely undisclosed. Every company involved has privacy policies. Every company involved can point to documentation that technically covers the behavior their browser exhibits. The problem is not that these companies are lying outright. The problem is that the gap between what the documentation says, if you read it carefully, and what the average user understands from the marketing language they encountered on the download page is wide enough that I think it deserves to be named and measured rather than defended on technical accuracy grounds. Technically defensible is not the same as honest communication. And in 2026, when privacy has become a premium marketing category that companies use to acquire users, the difference between those two things is the most important thing I can explain to you in this video. So here is how the rest of this video is structured. I'm going to walk you through what the network capture showed for each browser, starting with Brave and ending with the one browser that passed the test without qualification. I will give you the specific findings, the context that explains why those findings matter, and after all 5 browsers, I will give you concrete action items for whatever your current browser is, including exactly which settings to change if you decide to keep using the browser you have, and what to switch to if the findings convince you that your current browser is not doing what you installed it to do. The data from the network captures is what it is. It does not respond to marketing language. Let's see what it showed. All right, let's get into the actual findings. And I want to start with Brave because Brave is the browser that the largest number of privacy-conscious users have migrated to in the last 2 years. And I think it deserves the most careful treatment of any browser in this comparison. When you recommend something to people in this community, you carry some responsibility for that recommendation. And I want to make sure what I tell you about Brave is accurate rather than either defensively, loyal, or unfairly sensational. Brave's reputation in the privacy space is genuinely earned in several important areas. On privacytests.org, which runs automated browser privacy tests and publishes the results publicly, Brave consistently ranks near the top of the field for blocking tracking and fingerprinting. The Brave Shield system blocks third-party trackers, cross-site cookies, and fingerprinting attempts by default without requiring any configuration from the user. Brave also made the significant decision years ago to build their own independent search index, Brave Search, specifically so that search queries do not have to route through Google or Bing infrastructure. Those are real technical decisions with real privacy consequences, and they are meaningfully better than what Chrome gives you by default. I want to say that clearly before I tell you what the network capture showed, because this video is only valuable if I give you the complete picture rather than cherry-picking results to support a predetermined narrative. So, what did the Wireshark capture show on a fresh Brave install during the 15-minute idle session? The first category of connections was exactly what you would expect and what Brave publicly documents. Update. Check connections to Brave's own servers. Component verification connections that are part of how Chromium-based browsers maintain their security infrastructure. Safe browsing database update connections, which Brave routes through its own infrastructure rather than Google's, and that is a genuine improvement over Chrome's default behavior that is worth acknowledging. These connections are expected, and they are disclosed, and they are not what concerns me. What concerns me is what appeared in the capture alongside those expected connections. Brave operates an advertising network called Brave Ads. The system is designed to deliver what Brave calls privacy-respecting advertisements and reward users with basic attention token cryptocurrency for viewing them. This system is opt-in, it is transparently documented, and Brave has been public about its existence since the company launched the rewards program. I'm not disputing any of that. What I am telling you is what the network capture showed, which is that connections to infrastructure associated with the Brave Ads system were appearing during the idle startup session on a completely fresh installation where I had never opened the rewards panel, never enabled Brave Rewards, and never touched anything related to the advertising system at all. The connections were limited. They were not transmitting behavioral profiles or detailed browsing histories the way Google's advertising infrastructure does, but they were connections to advertising adjacent servers happening on a browser that tens of millions of people specifically installed because they wanted to escape advertising infrastructure entirely. And here is the precise problem with that finding. When someone who has been tracked by Google ads for 15 years, someone who watches their Chrome browser serve them ads for things they only mentioned out loud near their phone, someone who has read enough about surveillance capitalism to specifically seek out a privacy browser, when that person installs Brave, the mental model they are operating under is that they have left advertising infrastructure behind. The Brave Shield's logo in the toolbar reinforces that mental model every time they browse. The advertising adjacent connections during idle startup represent a structural contradiction between that mental model and the technical reality, not a catastrophic contradiction, not a reason to call Brave a surveillance browser, but a real gap between the impression the marketing creates and what the network capture documents. And I want to be specific about why this matters beyond just the technical finding itself. Brave's business model depends on its advertising network. The company is not a nonprofit. It needs revenue to operate. The way it generates that revenue is through Brave Ads. That is a legitimate business model, and I'm not criticizing it as unethical. But a business model that requires advertising infrastructure means a business model with an inherent tension between the privacy promise and the commercial reality. That tension does not disappear just because the advertising system is technically opt-in. It shows up in the network capture during idle startup on fresh installations, and users who made their browser choice based on Brave's privacy marketing deserve to know that it is there. Now, let's move to Firefox, and this is the one I want you to genuinely brace yourself for because the findings here hit differently than Brave. With Brave, the advertising infrastructure was a surprise, but the privacy protections are largely real. With Firefox, the surprise comes from a browser whose reputation carries 20 years of nonprofit privacy credentials behind it. And the gap between that reputation and what the idle session capture showed is the kind of finding that produces a specific feeling of betrayal that I think it is worth naming honestly. Mozilla is a nonprofit foundation. Firefox's code is fully open source and can be audited by anyone with the skills to do so. These accountability mechanisms are real, and they are mechanisms that Chrome and Edge fundamentally cannot match regardless of what their marketing departments claim. Total cookie protection in Firefox 2025 and 2026 genuinely isolates third-party cookies in separate storage partitions and prevents the cross-site tracking that defines the surveillance advertising ecosystem. Enhanced tracking protection in strict mode blocks a meaningful proportion of known trackers. And here is the single most important Firefox advantage that barely gets enough discussion in 2026. Firefox is the last major browser that fully supports the original Manifest v2 version of uBlock Origin. Google forced Chromium-based browsers to migrate to Manifest v3 with the Chrome 127 rollout, which crippled uBlock Origin's ability to block network requests the way it previously could. Firefox kept Manifest v2 support, which means installing uBlock Origin on Firefox still gives you one of the most effective tracker blocking tools available anywhere. That single feature alone makes a hardened Firefox dramatically more private than Chrome the moment you add one extension. So what did the idle capture show? 3 categories of connections that the average Firefox user who installed it for privacy reasons would not have expected to find. First, regular communication with Google servers for safe browsing lookups. This is documented in Mozilla's privacy policy if you read carefully. But the practical reality is that your browsing safety checks are being processed through Google infrastructure, even when you specifically chose Firefox to step outside Google's ecosystem. For users who migrated away from Chrome specifically because of the 2024 Google privacy lawsuit settlement and everything it revealed about Chrome's data collection practices, discovering that their non-Google browser still routes safety lookups through Google servers is a finding that deserves plain language explanation rather than privacy. Policy fine print. Second, telemetry traffic to Mozilla's own servers, enabled by default on fresh installations. The session capture showed initialization information, hardware configuration signals, and activity ping data confirming the browser was online and active. Mozilla's position is that this telemetry is anonymized and used only for product improvement. I have no specific evidence disputing that. But millions of users who installed Firefox specifically because they wanted a browser that did not phone home with their activity would not consider the default telemetry configuration acceptable if it were explained to them clearly on the first launch screen rather than buried in a settings menu that most people never open. Third, and the one that genuinely surprised me the most, was Pocket. Mozilla acquired Pocket, a read later content service back in 2017, and integrated it directly into Firefox. During my idle 15-minute capture on a fresh installation where I had never logged into Pocket, never used Pocket, and never once clicked the Pocket icon in the toolbar, Firefox was establishing connections to Pocket infrastructure and checking for content recommendations. A third-party content service making outbound connections from your browser before you have done anything to authorize it. The disclosure exists in Mozilla's documentation. The disclosure existing does not change what the network capture showed during 15 minutes of doing absolutely nothing. Here is what I need you to understand about Firefox specifically. The browser's default startup behavior and the browser's actual privacy capabilities, when properly configured, are 2 completely different things. An informed user who disables all telemetry, removes Pocket, switches safe browsing away from Google servers, enables Resisto Listendagsaf, fingerprinting in about config, and installs uBlock, Origin ends up with one of the most private mainstream browsers available anywhere. The problem is that the average user who installs Firefox based on its privacy reputation never does any of that. They install it, accept the defaults, and assume the reputation has been pre-applied. Based on what the network capture showed, that assumption is wrong in ways that matter. Okay, so we have covered Brave and Firefox, 2 browsers with genuine privacy credentials in specific areas, both showing startup behavior that the average user who chose them for privacy reasons would not have expected. But here's the thing. Those 2 were actually the more comfortable findings of this entire investigation. What I found when I ran the same test on DuckDuckGo and Opera is where the gap between marketing claim and network reality gets wide enough that I think it stops being a nuanced conversation. It starts being something that requires a direct recommendation to change your browser. Let me start with DuckDuckGo because I want to give this, one, the careful treatment it deserves. DuckDuckGo has built its entire brand identity around privacy more completely than any other company in this comparison. The search engine launched in 2008 specifically as a non-tracking alternative to Google at a time when nobody was talking about search privacy in mainstream tech conversations. The mobile browser developed a strong reputation through the early 2020s as one of the cleanest, lightweight privacy options on Android and iOS. The desktop browser, which is what I tested here, was positioned as the natural extension of that 15-year privacy-first identity into a full desktop browsing product. When DuckDuckGo says privacy on its marketing pages, it is not using privacy as a feature differentiator the way Brave does. It is using privacy as the entire reason the company exists. That brand promise is how DuckDuckGo acquired the user base it has. And that makes what the network capture showed significantly more meaningful than a telemetry checkbox being enabled by default. So what did the 15-minute idle capture show on a fresh DuckDuckGo desktop browser installation? Connections to Microsoft Bing infrastructure appeared during the startup session, before any search query had been submitted, before any browsing activity had occurred. Before I had clicked a single thing inside the browser, the connections to Microsoft servers were appearing as part of the browser's background initialization rather than as a response to something I had actively done to trigger them. Now, DuckDuckGo has been publicly transparent for years about the fact that their search product uses Microsoft Bing as a component of its search results infrastructure. That partnership is documented. But there is a meaningful difference between a search engine using Bing to serve results when you perform a search, and a browser establishing connections to Microsoft infrastructure during idle startup before any user-initiated activity has occurred. The first one is a disclosed business arrangement. The second one is a background behavior that most users who installed the browser to reduce their exposure to big tech infrastructure would not have anticipated finding in a network capture. But here is where the DuckDuckGo situation gets substantially more complicated than just the startup connections. In May 2022, security researcher Zach Edwards published findings from an independent audit of the DuckDuckGo mobile browser showing that DuckDuckGo was permitting Microsoft tracking scripts to execute on third-party websites while simultaneously blocking equivalent tracking scripts from Google and Facebook. The implication was that DuckDuckGo's search syndication agreement with Microsoft contractually prevented the browser from treating Microsoft tracking infrastructure the same way it treated tracking infrastructure from every other company. DuckDuckGo's CEO, Gabriel Weinberg, publicly confirmed the contractual arrangement at the time. DuckDuckGo subsequently expanded their tracker blocking to cover more Microsoft scripts following the public backlash in August 2022. But reporting from TechCrunch and other outlets through 2025 has documented that certain Microsoft conversion measurement scripts remain permitted under contractual carve-outs, even after the policy update. I want you to sit with that for a moment because the implication is significant. DuckDuckGo's ability to fully protect you from Microsoft tracking infrastructure is contractually limited by the same business relationship that makes DuckDuckGo's search product commercially viable. The company cannot simultaneously depend on Microsoft for search revenue and completely block Microsoft's tracking systems without threatening the business arrangement that funds the product. That structural conflict does not mean DuckDuckGo is deliberately deceiving users. It means the privacy protections they can actually deliver are structurally constrained in a way that the marketing language does not communicate adequately. And users who installed DuckDuckGo specifically because they were concerned about Microsoft's data collection practices, which is an entirely reasonable concern given what Windows 11 telemetry documentation reveals, deserve to know that the browser they installed to protect them from Microsoft has a contractual relationship with Microsoft that limits how completely it can do that job. The question the network data forces you to ask about DuckDuckGo is this: can a privacy browser, whose commercial viability depends on a partnership with a major tech company's search infrastructure, deliver comprehensive protection against that company's tracking systems? The network capture and the documented contractual history suggest the answer is no, not because DuckDuckGo is acting in bad faith, but because the structural reality of the business model makes comprehensive protection impossible while the partnership exists. Now, let's talk about Opera. And I want to be very deliberate about how I frame this, because Opera's situation involves a layer of complexity that goes beyond anything we encountered with Brave, Firefox, or DuckDuckGo. It also involves a corporate history that the average person installing Opera in 2026 has almost certainly never been told about. And I think that context is essential for evaluating what the network capture showed. Opera was originally a Norwegian browser company. Many people in this audience probably remember Opera from the early 2000s when it was a genuinely innovative browser that introduced tab browsing and speed dial years before mainstream browsers caught up. That history gives Opera a nostalgic credibility that its current marketing actively benefits from, even though the company that made the original Opera no longer exists in any meaningful sense. In 2016, Opera's consumer browser business was acquired by a consortium of Chinese investors led by Kunlun Tech, a Beijing-based technology company, for approximately $600 million US. Kunlun Tech currently holds approximately 69% controlling interest in Opera, with Kunlun's controlling shareholder Zhou Yahui serving as Opera's executive chairman. The Norwegian, who is at the roots, the NASDAQ listing, the Oslo headquarters, these facts are all technically accurate and Opera's marketing leans on them, but the controlling ownership structure is Chinese, and that ownership structure is subject to China's 2017 national intelligence law, which requires all Chinese companies to cooperate with state intelligence activities when required. I'm not asserting that user data is being transferred to Chinese government authorities. There's no verified public evidence of that specific outcome. What I am telling you is what the ownership structure means in terms of the theoretical data exposure risk and what the network capture showed in terms of actual startup behavior. The idle session capture on a fresh Opera installation was the most concerning of all 5 browsers tested in this comparison. Within the first 60 seconds of the session, before I had clicked anything or visited any URL, Opera established connections to multiple servers associated with advertising measurement platforms and behavioral analytics infrastructure. The traffic metadata indicated that what was being transmitted during this initialization phase included signals consistent with hardware fingerprinting, screen resolution, GPU configuration, operating system version, time zone setting, language configuration, and installed font list information. If you are not familiar with browser fingerprinting as a tracking technique, here is why that specific combination of data points matters. When those individual signals are combined together, they create what is effectively a stable identifier for your specific browser instance, as unique as a fingerprint, that can be used to track you across different websites, across different browsing sessions, and across different networks without needing to store any cookies or local data on your machine at all. It is the tracking technique that survives cookie deletion, private browsing mode, and VPN usage because it is based on characteristics of your hardware and software configuration rather than stored identifiers. Browser fingerprinting happening during idle startup on a browser that markets itself with privacy features on its homepage is not a minor finding. It is a fundamental contradiction between the product description and the product behavior. Then there is Opera's built-in VPN, which is probably the single feature that most people install Opera specifically to use. Opera markets this feature prominently as a privacy tool that protects your traffic. What it actually is, technically, is a proxy service that routes your traffic through Opera's own servers rather than encrypting your traffic end-to-end through independently audited infrastructure. The distinction matters enormously. A genuine VPN routes your traffic through a third-party server in a way that even the VPN provider cannot easily link to your identity, particularly if the provider maintains a verified no-logs policy audited by independent security firms like the audits that Mullvad VPN and Proton VPN undergo regularly. An Opera VPN routes your traffic through Opera's own infrastructure, which means your browsing activity is visible to Opera's systems, subject to Opera's logging decisions, and ultimately accessible to Opera's ownership structure. Opera's built-in VPN passed a no-log audit by Deloitte in 2024, and I want to be fair in acknowledging that. But an audit covering a specific time period is not the same as the structural transparency that comes from a browser-independent VPN operated by a company whose sole business is privacy rather than a browser company with an advertising revenue model and a controlling shareholder subject to foreign intelligence law. The combined picture that the Opera network capture produces, fingerprinting traffic during idle startup, advertising measurement connections, a self-hosted proxy marketed as a privacy VPN, and a controlling ownership structure operating under foreign intelligence law, represents the largest gap between marketing claim and technical reality of any browser I tested. If you are using Opera in 2026 specifically because you believe the privacy marketing on the download page, the network capture data represents a meaningful reason to reconsider that decision rather than a minor nuance to mentally file away. 3 browsers tested so far, 3 different varieties of the same fundamental problem. Marketing language that is technically defensible in narrow interpretations while communicating something substantially more favorable than the network traffic evidence supports. The only question remaining is whether any browser in this comparison actually delivers what all 4 of these promised. Tell me to continue, and I will show you what the 5th capture looked like, and why the result was so clean that I ran the test 3 times on 2 different machines just to make sure I had not made A methodological error. All right, 4 browsers tested, 4 network captures showing behavior that ranged from mildly inconsistent with marketing claims to genuinely concerning depending on which browser you were looking at. And now we get to the 5th browser, the one that most of you watching this have probably never installed, possibly never heard of, and almost certainly never seen advertised anywhere because it has no advertising budget, no sponsored YouTube content, no homepage with stock photography of happy people protecting their data on sleek laptops. LibreWolf does not market itself the way any of the other 4 browsers in this comparison do, which is actually the first signal that it belongs in a different category entirely. Let me give you the background first, because context matters before I show you the capture results. LibreWolf is a community-maintained Firefox fork. It was created and is maintained by a team of privacy-focused developers whose entire design philosophy can be summarized in one sentence. Take Firefox, remove every default configuration that compromises privacy, document every decision publicly, and ship the result. That is not a marketing tagline. That is literally the project description on their documentation. The code base is fully open source. Every privacy-related configuration decision the team makes is documented with their reasoning. The build process is publicly documented and reproducible, which means technically capable users can independently verify that what they are downloading matches what the source code says it should be. In 2026, when transparency claims from browser companies have become a standard marketing tool, the ability to independently verify those claims, rather than just read them on a homepage, is a meaningful differentiator. What LibreWolf ships with, by default, without requiring any configuration from the user, is this. All Mozilla telemetry disabled completely, not just turned down, removed. Pocket integration stripped out of the browser entirely, not hidden in settings, gone. Google Safe browsing replaced with a local alternative that does not route lookups through Google servers. uBlock Origin bundled and active in the default installation. Resist fingerprinting enabled by default rather than buried in about.config where most users never find it. Strict enhanced tracking protection as the default rather than the standard mode. Third-party cookies blocked by default. WebRTC configured to prevent IP address leaks even when using a VPN, which is one of the most common and least discussed privacy vulnerabilities that most other browsers leave wide open by default. Every single one of these settings is something a sufficiently informed and motivated Firefox user can configure manually. LibreWolf simply ships them as the out-of-the-box defaults, so that the average user gets the privacy outcome without needing to know what any of those technical settings mean or where to find them. So when I set up the clean Windows 11 environment, installed LibreWolf from the official project website, launched it, and started the 15-minute Wireshark capture using the exact same methodology I applied to every other browser in this test. Here is what the network traffic showed. Update checks to LibreWolf's own project update servers, and nothing else.